Buenas tardes, gracias por estar aquí. Vamos el micrófono por aquí. Buenas tardes nuevamente, gracias por estar aquí. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you to open the academic activities of our master's program in translation. And it is, above all, an honor to have the presence of such a special guest, the Professor Luc van Doorslaer. I don't really know how to pronounce his last name.
Perfect.
Before giving the floor to the director of the School of Languages, Jaime Uzma, and to Professor Juan Guillermo Ramirez, who will kindly introduce our guest, I would like to extend a warm welcome to the students of the fourth cohort of our translation program, those who are present here and those who are following our broadcast on YouTube. So thank you very much and welcome for being here. Jaime, you have the floor.
No, just hello. My name is Jaime Uzma. I'm the director of the School of Languages. I'm very happy to be here. The first event we have in the School of Languages for this year, and it is the first of many events, academic events we will have. And I'm really, really happy to have the new cohort of students, and very happy to have Luc here. Welcome to Medellin again.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all the people who make this possible, especially Juan Guillermo, Paula, Alejandro, Martica Pulido, Paula, all the people who have been working to make this real. It's not easy to open a cohort of a master's program in translation in a public university in Colombia. It's not easy. It implies a lot of work, and you may not know that, but it is a lot of work. It's more than a year of work and preparation, etc., etc. And we have it. So welcome to all the students. This is a very nice place to study. Just let me know whenever you need anything. Go send me a message, an email, a WhatsApp message, and I will be attentive, and all the team in the School of Languages will be very willing to help you. Very happy to have the new line in interpretation. This is something that is innovative, and we are very happy to see that this is a reality now. The people who are in the line of interpretation, you are not only students. You are the people who will open the interpretation line or area in the School of Languages. And you will be the people who will be preparing the future interpreters in the School of Languages. The same that happened with the people who have been studying in this master's program and in other programs of translation, who are now the teachers of the translators in the undergraduate program. I'm not a translator, I'm not an interpreter, I'm a teacher, but I'm very happy to be learning with you during all these years. So thank you, Alejo, for having me here. Thank you, Luc.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jaime. And now Juan Guillermo is going to introduce our guest.
Thank you. On behalf of the program committee, it is a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Luc van Doorslaer. He is a professor of translation studies at the University of Tartu in Estonia. He is a former president of CETRA, the Center for Translation Studies at Leuven in Belgium, and professor extraordinary at Stellenbosch University. Since 2016, he has been vice president of EST, the European Society for Translation Studies. He is journal editor of Translation in Society and book series editor of Translation, Interpreting, and Transfer. Together with Yves Gambier, he is the editor of the Online Translation Studies Bibliography and the 5 volumes of the Handbook of Translation Studies. Other recent books edited include Interconnecting Translation Studies and Imagology, Border Crossings, Translation Studies and Other Disciplines, Methods in News Translations, and The Situatedness of Translation Studies, Temporal and Geographical Dynamics of Theorization. His main research interests include journalism and translation, sociology of translation, imagology and translation, translation policy, and the institutionalization of translation studies. He has been researching recently on how translation studies nowadays is a discipline no longer dealing with interlingual transfer only, but also with intralingual as well as intercultural communication, transfer, and all changes involved in processes of rewriting and adaptation. So today he'll be giving us our opening lecture on travel writing as translation. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to Professor Van Dosler.
Do I need that too? No, this one's fine. Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction. Sounds impressive when I hear that. Don't expect too much. It's good that you said it's the first event in a whole series of events, so then you don't have to expect too much at the beginning. It will always get better the whole year through. You cannot compare it yet. No, it's great to be here. I had actually two reasons to come here. First of all, Marta, when we met 7 years ago, she has told me, whenever you're in Colombia, then let me know and we will certainly invite you to university. Then I came at the very beginning of the academic year, but nevertheless, I told her I'm very happy to be here and thanks for that invitation, already 7 years old by now. And on the other hand, it's a very special occasion for me because it's the very first time in my life, and I've given many of these talks, but it's the very first time in my life that I give a talk where my daughter is present. So the one sitting there, yeah, who is traveling around through South America already for 11 months right now. And, well, it's one of the reasons why I would like to talk about travel and translation. Travel writing, travel, well, you will see. Nowadays, when people talk about translation, then the expectations are very often, oh, it will be about AI, artificial intelligence, or about machine translation. I will not talk about that. So those who expected that, they can already leave the room now. I will not talk about that because it's very much related to what you mentioned, what the way I conceptualize translation. Well, not only me, the way I look at translation, I will certainly mention that here as well. And I think it's very much related to the whole experience of travel, the whole experience of travel writing as well. Yeah, there are two universities because you mentioned that, even a third one, but, well, I left it to the two logos only. What would I like to do today? What am I going to talk about? I'll try to talk some 45 minutes, 60 minutes. If it's too long, then just let me know, and then I will stop. I can talk for hours about this topic, but that may be a bit too long. And sorry, I have to apologize. I do not know Spanish at all. So I have been given talks all over the world, and I never feel guilty when I speak English. And here I started feeling guilty because Spanish is everywhere and is so dominant, of course, and English is a bit alienating to speak English, more than in other parts of the world in general. No, not in China, it's the same. Yeah, next time I will try to learn some Spanish as well. But nevertheless, I try to find at least a couple of examples that have to do with Spanish, and I'll try to avoid pronouncing the Spanish as well. When it's about translation, there are a lot of, I would call them cliches. It's very often about the loss. Now, what do you lose in translation? You know this movie, it's already 15 or 20 years old, I think, but I liked it a lot with what are the names again? Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson, Lost in Translation. So I read, but correct me if I'm wrong, I read that in Spain, this was also the title. In Spain, it was announced as Lost in Translation. But in Latin America, it was not. That was interesting because I found some sources that said that this was the title in Latin America. Well, that is in Spanish-speaking Latin America. So Bill Murray again, without Scarlett Johansson. An interesting thing is that here, it's lost in translation. You can get lost in translation when you travel. But here, it's perdidos en Tokio. So you are lost in travel, if you want, or because of traveling. So you see, there is already an interesting parallelism between losing something in translation and losing something in traveling or while traveling. In both cases, it's only one side of the coin, of course, because when we travel, usually, well, we have both experiences. On the one hand, we think, oh, this is alienating and I don't know the language and I don't know the cultural experience. But on the other hand, we also usually experience it as something very enriching. So that is there as well. The same goes for translation. My point will be a translation is always something where you lose things and where you gain things. There are 2 books nowadays that are called Gained in Translation, by the way. And that is something that especially, well, outsiders, people who do not really deal with translation, that they sometimes forget. They concentrate a bit on this cliche. And I think we have to get rid of this cliche. And I hope that, well, my talk can very slightly contribute to that as well. So losing something in translation, losing something in traveling, and the other side of the coin as well. Before we get there, I think we have to talk about, well, the main thing. What is translation? A lot of people have a certain idea. And the interesting thing is that in research, we have very often a different idea, or at least a broader idea. Certainly not only the original meaning of the concept of translation that is generally spread. And that's, first one is clear. Now, I looked at many dictionaries in many languages, and they more or less say the same. The first is always this one. This is a UK dictionary where it said something that is translated, or the process, so the product and the process, both of them actually, from one language to another. And almost everyone would say, okay, this is the essential thing. We need languages. We transfer from one language into another. That is translation. Well, yes and no. Because in the same dictionary, there is also a second meaning. It says, it is the activity or process of changing something into a different form. No one talks about a language here, but this is much more general, much broader, of course. No? Is this only the metaphorical sense? I don't think so. No? So interesting. Okay, this is an English dictionary. The Brits are sometimes a bit weird. Maybe it's only there. No, I looked at an American dictionary as well. Rendering from one language into another, that's the process, or also the product of such a rendering, which is, well, very similar to what is said there. But also in Merriam-Webster, the second definition, the second use is a change to a different substance, form, or appearance. Interesting. Substance, form, or appearance. That's more or less everything. Huh? So everything that changes is a translation, if you read this. And then you may think, well, yeah, that's maybe only in English. We don't have that in Spanish. I'm not going to read the Spanish, but I had a look at, well, this dictionary. I don't know how relevant it is, but it sounded interesting to me. Real Academia Española, okay. It says more or less the same. The second meaning is also about convertir, mudar, trocar. So you have that change as well, synonyms, cambiar, and so on. So why is everyone only thinking about languages? Because it's much broader than that, at least the second meaning. But I find it everywhere. When I look at Dutch language, Dutch is my mother tongue, Dutch language dictionaries and other language dictionaries, I always find this. Okay, that already is important as a start, I think. Because if we agree with that, or if we accept that, if we start from there, then I have so many experiences where I think, this is translation. So I went a couple of days ago to the, how do you say it, Museo de Antioquia or so? Botero. I know that Marta told me at the very beginning when I was here, she said, you will know Fernando Botero. I thought, Botero, I've heard that name, but who is that again? And then she explained, painter, the most famous artist of Medellin, I have to say here. And she explained what he was painting, and I immediately told you, oh, that's actually Rubens. I think of Rubens, Baroque painter, who was the famous painter from my hometown. I come from Antwerp, in Spanish, Amberes. So Rubens worked there. Huh? So that's interesting, because I know the work of Rubens, of course, and we went to the museum, and we saw from Botero this. Mrs. Rubens number 4. I thought, Mrs. Rubens number 4? I've seen this before. Huh? Of course, yeah. Because Rubens, back in the 1620s, painted this, huh? El sombrero de paja. And then, this is what Botero made of it in the 1960s. Well, number 4, because he made several other paintings also referring to Rubens. Okay, a change of substance, form, or appearance, it said. Well, the substance hasn't really changed, I would say, but the form and the appearance have clearly changed. So according to that definition in Merriam-Webster, of course this is translation. Of course this is, well, what we will call later copying with differences. Okay, if we accept this, if we start from that second definition, then translation is a bit everywhere in society. That's good. Good for us who study translation, because it broadens our whole object of research as well. Okay, Rubens and Botero, there will be many more examples. So, I'm trying to undermine that idea that translation only has to do with languages. And there are other arguments for that as well. Because why is it that we only think of languages, that a lot of people say it's exclusively languages translation? Do you see that in the term translation? No, we have a different perspective, especially in translation studies. When you see a T on my PowerPoint, it's always translation. TS is always translation studies. So how, or to what extent is it necessarily language related? The Latin form that we all use in a lot of languages, translatio, well, you don't see the concept, the term at least, for languages in there. You know what it means, bringing over to somewhere else, the transfer to, not necessarily about languages. When I look at the English, it's the same because it's derived from Latin. This is interesting. I work in Estonia nowadays, which is completely different, but you have to believe me, Tolga has nothing to do with languages either. So it's also a completely different term. For those who know German, Übersetzung, so again, bringing over to somewhere else, but not about languages. There is not Sprache, there is not the concept, not the term language there. Or all the Romance languages, also derived from the Latin, of course. Traducción, traduzione, traducción, tradução. Where are the languages? Why do we only think, and why is that first definition only referring to languages? It's not there in the term. Maybe some of you do know languages where the concept or the term for language is in the term for translation. I do. Because I only know two, from the languages I know, I only know two exceptions. My mother tongue, Dutch, and a language that is derived from it, Afrikaans, in the south of Africa. Because we say vertalen, and talen is the concept for languages. So this is actually translanguaging, if you want, a concept that is also used in research, by the way. So that are the two only exceptions that I know of where languages are in the term for translation. Okay, so in Dutch, in my mother tongue, we could say no. Translation always has to do with languages, based on the term, but that's not the case. Good, so you see, I'm trying to collect a couple of arguments against that use. Well, I have already started actually, but this is an outline. What I would like to do in the next 45 minutes, I will talk about that object extension of the term, first of all, and secondly, in research, in translation studies. That has been going on for decades now. I mean, there are still people only dealing with languages, what we call interlingual translation, which you mentioned as well. But there are a lot of researchers doing much more than that. And I will talk about, well, different conceptualizations. We are in the humanities, and it's very typical for the humanities that, well, we do not necessarily have one exact definition of the object we research, we investigate. Sometimes people have blamed me for that. They say, well, translation studies, you don't even have one clear definition for translation. But that colleague was from literary studies, and it's easy to counter-argue, because I asked him, do you have one clear definition for literature? Of course not. In cultural studies, do they have one clear concept of culture? Of course not. There are several definitions. So it's typical for translation studies. With mathematicians, it's more difficult. Usually they do have, or physicians or whatever, they do have one exact definition, but not in the humanities. I will use that for, well, at least giving a couple of examples of parallels in the conceptualization and in the use of translation and of travel as well. I will partly problematize national categorizations. What I mean by that, I will tell you in a minute. And then I will give examples of, well, travel and translations, how translations travel, and maybe also how travelers translate. That belongs to it. That goes both ways, I think. I will talk about city translation, which is a different level than national categorizations. I will talk about knowledge translation, because we constantly translate knowledge and transfer knowledge. About museum translation, we just visited, well, very briefly, the museum of the university, and it's very interesting about translation, not only about interlingual translation, but mainly about what I will call later cultural translation. And I will give you one study that I liked a lot, one article about Romania, a Romance language country in Europe, and the two-way translation that was presented there. And then I will give a couple of conclusions, and then we can talk and have questions, a Q&A session if you want. So that's what we call paradigm change in the thinking about translation. As I told you, is already, well, several decades old, and not everyone would agree with it, but you do see that more and more people in translation studies are following that, are practicing that in a way. So this is the traditional view, I would call it, that has not disappeared. It's still there, but that is how a lot of people look at translation. It's practice-bound and it's text-bound. It's only about a text and it's only about translation practice. And when you work as a translator, you're very often confronted with that, where a commissioner will tell you, only translate, only change the language. Those who translate know that it's not possible, because it starts from the idea that languages are equivalent. Of course, languages are not equivalent, because languages are culture-bound, are context-bound, and the context and the cultures are different. So the idea, the traditional idea, and traditional means since 200 years, not longer than that, because before that was also different. There is a focus on non-change. Don't change anything except for the language. It starts from the idea of sameness. You can't say exactly the same thing in different languages. It starts from the idea that meaning is stable. Meaning is, of course, not stable. There are a lot of concepts that have different meanings in different cultures in different parts of the world, or between different persons in the same culture even. So that equivalence concept is an older concept, some would say outdated concept in looking at translation. Very often it was also intention-based. So did the author mean that? Was that the intention of the author? Well, when I translate Shakespeare, I usually don't know what Shakespeare intended. I cannot ask him anymore. But even if it's a contemporary author, I don't know either, because I know many examples of authors who maybe 10 years ago said something about their work, and now 10 years later they would say something completely different. That changes, no? So that flexibility in meaning, that is important. So intention-based, and yeah, as a consequence, people then have a very normative, have a very prescriptive idea about looking at translation. So whenever you change something, then it's bad. Then a translator is blamed, and translator is said, no, but this is different from what there was in the source text, what is usually called original, but I don't use it because that already makes us look at translation in a kind of hierarchy as well. So a change is something negative. So it's deforming, and you know, de is always used in negative constructions, devaluating or deconstructing or whatever. That is the traditional view. The newer view, since a couple of decades, is this one, the modern research view, I would call it, where it is about texts. You can even discuss the concept of text, because in text studies there are several definitions about text as well, and beyond. Botero Rubens. Some people in text studies would also say that that painting is clearly also a text. You can perfectly consider that a text. So we start from, well, as in opposition to the non-change idea, the inevitability of change. When you translate, of course you change, and not only the language, but also the language. The inevitability of change in choices, the difference that will always be there, the fact that there is no fixed meaning. That doesn't mean that everything is right or correct. But when you ask two excellent translators to translate the same text, it will never lead to two same translations, of course. Why not? Because there is no fixed meaning, because there are certain nuances that are experienced in a different way. So it is about transfer, it's not about equivalence, it's always about transfer and exchange of information, and always related to an intercultural act as well. So what we do in translation studies nowadays is not intention-based. What did the author intend? No, we look at reality. We look at translations and how they function. And then you see huge differences, which is interesting for researchers actually. Translators, and especially commissioners, don't always like that, but that is reality. We more and more look at sociological aspects, the elements of power, the actors that are involved, the framework, the trajectories of translations. Everything that changes, and a lot changes, that we call transformation. And transformation is actually a positive concept in opposition to deformation, if you want. So that's the general framework I'm working in, and translation studies is nowadays working in as well. Yeah, I referred to the sociological concepts and approaches. I'm actually involved in a journal myself that wanted to focus on that, translation in society. We started 2 years ago, where we very much focus on that kind of approach, sociological approaches. It's about transfers, it's about trajectories of translations. We use a lot of sociological influence there as well. Not only sociological, mainly sociological. You know that quite a lot of sociologists have written about translation as well. So if you ever want to publish about translation from that point of view, please submit something for translation in society. This, of course, this view on translation also changes the view on translators, the main actors, if you want. You know who this is? Saint Jerome, the patron saint of the translators. The question is whether you need a patron saint, but okay, translators have one. Saint Jerome, probably the painting that was used most for depicting him from the 5th century it was, I think. Yeah, that already creates an idea and an image about the profession of a translator. He was a translator. What did he do? He had a book, he had a pen, and it seems like a boring job. No? He was sitting there like that. So it's not very dynamic. So already the choice of a patron saint says something about our image of translators nowadays. Again, since Romanticism, 250 years. Before that, it was different. We could perfectly change that as well. There was a colleague who 10 years ago, I think, said, let's replace Saint Jerome by Hermes. Hermes is the messenger of the gods. Looks already a bit sexier, a bit more dynamic than Saint Jerome. Let's use Hermes for the translators. What is Hermes? The messenger of the gods? Who is moving between two worlds. That's interesting, because that's what a translator is always doing. Huh? So we travel, if you want, between two worlds. We are the specialists of border crossing. Yeah? These two worlds were also interesting, the worlds of the mortal and the divine. That's what Hermes was doing. So that ambivalence of a translator, where do you belong to? To the source culture, to the target culture, to both? Are we somewhere in between? So it already problematizes the view on the position of the translator as well. What I also like is that Hermes is not only that, not only the messenger, but he's also a god himself. So the messenger of the gods and a god that is very ambivalent itself. Huh? He's the god of the thieves and the manipulator. Yeah, that's what translators do. We manipulate. And he's the god of the boundaries and of the transgression of boundaries. Wow, this is much better than Saint Jerome, of course. So let's use Hermes from now on. So maybe it's at the beginning of the entrance of the School of Languages, a nice sculpture made by, well, not Botero himself anymore, from Hermes. Okay, I give you a couple of ideas. Looking at translation, well, this way. Those who are in translation studies will know these authors and will know these views. Those who are not in translation studies and who thought of translation mainly in that first definition will, well, that may support them in changing a bit the view on translation. Andrew Chesterman, already back, well, the first time in '97, he wrote this book on memes of translation, but later also, well, considered translation as memes. Well, I like that a lot because nowadays, the young people here, the students here, that is the generation of the memes, no? The 21st century. They work with memes every day. No? So Chesterman would say they work with translation every day because every time you spread a meme, you translate. That would be his view, and it's also my view on that. What did he say, Andrew Chesterman? Well, memes are clearly less constrained by sameness, so you don't start from that idea of non-change. No, you accept and you play with the change and with the sameness and with the differences mainly. So there is what he called an adequate similarity. I like that as well. It's not really a contradiction, it's a paradox. No? There is similarity and it's adequate, but it's not identity, it's not the same. That is what a translation is. It's never the same, but it's related to it, just as a meme. It's always related to that, well, source text you are starting from, of course. There is no transfer in the classical sense, but it is about sharing, spreading, distributing, and I quote him here, duplicating with variation. This is Mrs. Rubin's number 4, no? Duplicating with variation. This is what Botero did. So that's a meme, if you want. There is no equation, but in every translation we see an additive operation. So it's not about lost in translation. No, you add something new. An additive operation where mutations are normal, where they are accepted. And he showed it this way. The classical way for us of looking at a translation is what traditionally was called an original in a translation, or a source text replaced by a target text. But that is, of course, not what is happening. Chesterman says, no, the source text is the first situation, and then the new situation is that the source text doesn't disappear. No, it's still there. It's an additive operation because every translation, every meme if you want, adds a new text, adds a new target text. Target text 1, target text 2, and so on, endless. So that is a very different view, very different conceptualization of translation as a meme. Another quote of his, next to duplicating with variation, is divergent similarity. Again, that's paradox, if you want. It's similar, but it's also different. Divergent similarity. Okay, that's one author. The other author I like referring to is Maria Timoshko, both from the same generation and both in the 90s here, but two excellent scholars, certainly back then. I think they introduced a lot of interesting new concepts and conceptualizations of translation. Yeah, Maria Timoshko is also famous for other things, Eurocentrism concept, decolonization of translation studies, but I'm not going to talk about that here. That would need a couple of other lectures. What I'm interested in here is her conceptualization of translation as a cluster concept. So it's not only that interlingual translation, there are a lot of other possibilities, gradual differences from adaptation over localization to similar types of change. That all belongs to, well, let's call it an umbrella concept that is translation. She works with metonymy, so not about metaphors anymore, not the classical metaphors of translation. The translation is a bridge. She says, no, it's about metonymy. What is a metonymy? Where one aspect is very much stressed. The crown is a metonymy for the British royal house. That doesn't mean that all the rest is gone. It's not a metaphor either. It's not a symbol, but it's one specific aspect that is then stressed. That's a metonymy. I'm going to read this full quote because I think it's very important for knowing her idea about translation. Translation is always a partial process. That's a very absolute statement, of course. Always a partial process. Interesting. Tell that to the commissioner who tells you as a translator, now translate this text. Oh, I will translate it partially. I wouldn't put it that way, but it is necessarily that, because some, but not all of the source text is transposed. So if you want, we will lose some, but you will also gain some, of course, in the way that translations represent source text by highlighting specific segments or parts. And that explains why these two excellent translators that translate the same source text will have different translators, because they will, well, partly read different things in it. They have partly a different background. So they will highlight specific segments or parts, or by allowing specific attributes of the source text to dominate. It's about some things that become more important than others. That's exactly what we do when we spread memes, of course. One specific, usually humoristic aspect that is then very much stressed, that is dominating, and the rest is not. Yeah, metonymic instead of metaphorical, I told you that. So any relation, not only highlighting the similarity, but any relation between the texts. Maybe some of you know Linda Hutchin, the grand old lady, well, old, 76 she is, the grand lady of adaptation studies, originally coming from literary studies, who gradually started realizing, when translation study scholars like John Milton from Brazil also started going to adaptation studies conferences, who started realizing, wow, there is of course no clear distinction between a translation and an adaptation. They are actually very close, because it's all about gradual differences. This newer sense of translation, as she called it, comes much closer to defining adaptation as well. That belongs to that cluster concept of Timoshko. Some of you think now he's talking for, 20 minutes, and he still hasn't talked about traveling. Well, I did in the beginning, but I think we do need all this. Let me give you an example, because this is already about traveling in our mind, I think. You may have read this one. It's one of the most spread and distributed narratives, if you want, in our literary history. Sherlock Holmes. So Arthur Conan Doyle wrote in the 1890s, I think, wrote this book. And then after that, it's incredible what has been done with that. You may have seen a theater play. There were hundreds of theater translations, if you want, of Arthur Conan Doyle. Maybe you watched the TV series. The ladies usually watch the one with Benedict Cumberbatch. Maybe you watched one of the many movies. This is the one with Jude Law, and so on. Okay, that is into semiotic translation that we know, but much more than that. Again, the younger generation may have played PlayStation. You have games nowadays, games about Sherlock Holmes. Several ones, well, dozens of games. So this is a very nice illustration of how, well, this travels and how this distributes and how this changes through different media. How does this relate to research on travel and translation? I first have to, well, make that distinction, because when I look at the existing research on travel and translation, I see two main lines, I think. On the one hand, well, there is what is called tourism translation. Tourism translation is quite clear. It's translation of a type of text, touristic texts. And there are specific problems involved and issues involved when translating touristic texts. Textual and cultural orientation, well, more or less the type of issues that we know with a lot of texts when we translate them in the relatively traditional way, I think. I took this from two authors who wrote, well, you mentioned the Handbook of Translation Studies as well. By the way, yeah, Marta told me you have to mention that, or you have to refer to that. So it means Handbook of Translation Studies. There is also an online version. It's all in English now. It's about overview articles, some 200 of the existing research. But the interesting thing is we have different language versions. And look, these are a couple of the Spanish translations, and you may recognize a name there, one of the translators. So maybe we have to continue doing that because we only have some 10 for Spanish, whereas for other languages we have many more. But okay, that was just a short thing in between. The second line of research is a more complicated and for that reason a more interesting one, I think. This comes from an article by Michael Cronin. You may know him from Ireland, one of the big names in translation studies over the past 20 years or so, who approaches travel and translation, not as tourism translation, but as this, a translator as a traveler, moving between two worlds, if you want, Hermes, and a traveler as a translator. So it's linked very much his approach to globalization. I mean, we're all traveling. I travel as well, and when I come here, I translate myself in a different way than when I give a talk in my own country, although I now work not in my own country any longer. That's also a kind of self-translation. It is about power issues. Even language is about power issues. No? If I had to give this talk in Spanish, I would feel not so confident. So the fact that I do it in English is already a power issue, which can be called, which is often related to a discovery. That's the positive interpretation, if you want. When we travel, we discover things. But traveling can also mean, well, conquering in a way by using certain languages or by imposing certain languages. Well, I don't have to explain that in South America because you all speak Spanish, but of course that has not always been the case. That is, of course, already the result of a language that was imposed over here. Migration is very much about traveling and always about translation as well. When someone migrates, he or she, of course, is translating him or herself, is self-translating. Not only linguistically, but also related to cultural translation, if you want. You have to adapt to new circumstances, to new habits, and so on and so forth. So that is actually how Cronin is approaching and describing that approach or that line of research. I think when I return, I will return tomorrow evening already to Europe, I will now say. But very often, at least in Europe, and if it's different here, then please tell me. Countries are very often top of mind. Of course, we have a lot of identities and we have a lot of levels that we can refer to. When we travel, very often people will ask me, how was Colombia? Well, I've been in Rio Negro and in Medellin. So, how was Colombia? Difficult to answer that, but that's probably the first question they will ask me. Or maybe they think continentally. Maybe they ask, how was South America? Yeah, okay. Difficult. Huh? Colombia would be top of mind, I think. Here I discovered, I didn't know when I started reading about it, people are not so often or not necessarily talking about Colombia. They talk about, oh, we are Paisa, huh? And it's Antioquia. Okay, I went to a museum, Museo de Antioquia. Huh? Okay, I was in Medellin, I stay in Laureles, that I know a bit better. So what level are we talking about? Huh? You can perfectly refer to all of them, but usually people, at least in Europe, think very much or have the country very much top of mind. The first day we were here, we had a nice city tour, and our guide was called Pablo. It was the best guide we ever had, I think. It was incredible. It was so good. And he was constantly questioning and problematizing that as well. He talked about Colombia, but at the same time, well, I have to say, he had been in Europe. He studied in Budapest and had been to Paris and so on. So he realized very much that he was mixing up certain things and approaching them from, well, other perspectives as well. And very often he said, well, is it Colombia or is it this region or is it about Medellin? So that was interesting to hear that from a guide, because usually you have these classical guides who then give you dates and names and so on. That was not what he was doing. This was an exceptional guide, I think. Are there any alternatives for national categorization when when we travel and when we want to talk about our traveling, when we want to translate that to others. Yeah, I mentioned earlier, maybe they ask me about South America, which is then a subcontinent, not even a level. But yeah, we can talk in continental categories. But is that any better? That's, of course, even more like a generalization, of course, which has very often been done in post-nationalism or in post-colonialist approaches, because it was related to power relationships to, well, the colonization period, mainly to Europe and the rest, or the West and the rest, that's the thing, where continents were used as units. But I think the problem you have with national categorizations, you also have them at continental level. You can talk about Eurocentrism, about Americentrism, Sinocentrism, Africentrism, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing is that there are certain countries that are transcontinental themselves, so I like that, because Russia and Turkey, they are both in Europe and in Asia, so you cannot use these, well, cliches or categorizations about continents in those cases. Sometimes we try to go beyond this country thinking by using transnational entities. I mean, almost all the borders between countries are, of course, constructed, unless when it's about an island, maybe. But otherwise, yeah, that's why borders are also changing, sometimes with wars and sometimes without. So transnational entities also relativize that to a certain extent. I don't know how often you use that, but we talk about the, you say Caribbean or Caribbean? I hear that both, actually. But yeah, does it mean that they form one entity and that you can talk about them as an entity, these inhabitants of these islands, the fact that they live on islands? That one possibility. It's interesting, I was looking for examples from here, and I found this. I don't think a lot of you say, oh, I live in the Pacific Alliance, because it's more like a trade union or so, but interesting that there is an organization referring to 4 countries at the Pacific, calling themselves a Pacific Alliance. So you can construct that yourself. Whether it's successful or not, that's still something else. I nowadays work in Estonia, in Tartu, which is there, where the eye of Estonia is. 50 kilometers away from the Russian border. That's usually the question that I get. Well, oh, wow, what did I do? Like this, okay. Well, there is a huge lake in here and no one is living at the other side, so it's still safe. But most people, well, when somewhere else in Belgium, my home country, when I read the press there, they hardly ever write about Estonia or about Latvia or about Lithuania. They say the Baltics. That's, well, we don't know the differences there. Well, actually, since I live there, it's a huge difference. They hardly have any connection. They don't understand each other because there are 3 different languages. The language here, Estonian, is only related to Finnish. It's a Finno-Ugric language. These 2 languages are related, but then when you look at the history, these 2 countries are Protestant, which has very much determined the way they, well, maybe even think, whereas Lithuania is a Catholic country and was very much related historically to Poland. So the only thing, what connects them is that they, well, when I started living there in the beginning, I said, you belong to the Soviet Union. No, you didn't belong. We were occupied by the Soviet Union, which is historically true. So that connects them. But in our image building about this transcontinental unity, yeah, that is a unity. And that's what people would say. You traveled to the Baltics. How were the Baltics? Like South America. You can also work at a lower level if you want, the translation of cities. I know something about Medellin right now, but, well, still not too much. But at least I was in Laureles and I was downtown and I was at Comuna 13, it was called, and I was at Parque Arvi and so on. So I know a few things. Some of you may know the work of Sherry Simon, the Canadian author from the University of Montreal, who published a book on Montreal that was very successful, actually. And this is very much about how travelers translate and how, when we travel, how we constantly renegotiate the values of our home city. Of course, it's not a coincidence that when I see Mrs. Rubens number 4, that I think of Rubens in Antwerp, because that's what I know. If I came from, I don't know, an African country, I would probably see other things in Botero. So we constantly renegotiate by comparing with where we come from. And we translate those values if you want. Yeah, this is a quote. There is a lot in there. I don't have the time to go into there. How translation shapes an understanding of a city. Translation by how you present it, but also by what you still present. You can imagine that, for instance, the names of streets in Tartu, where I live in Estonia, in Soviet times, they were there in Estonian and in Russian. You don't find them in Russian anymore. So, of course, a city changes completely because of geopolitical circumstances, for instance. That's what Galasso and Scaramella also mentioned. So, travel writing is always a combination of these, well, 3 types of translation, not only interlingual, but also intralingual. So rewording, reformulating in your own language when you talk about that, for instance, or intersemiotic translation like the examples I already gave you. So whenever we travel, we cannot avoid self-translating. We translate our own past, our own experiences, and we compare it to where we are going. And we, of course, culturally filter. I will give that example about Romania soon. It's not a coincidence that Simon, after writing about her home city, Montreal, wrote several articles and chapters about cities in what in German is called Mitteleuropa, so Central Europe. It's already interesting in itself. Here you would talk about North America, Central America, and South. So between the center is between North and South. In Europe, the center is usually between West and East. Western Europe, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe. Although in Scandinavia, I know people from their northern perspective who then say, you were in Norway, who then say, oh yeah, Central Europe, that's actually... So working with wind directions is very problematic, of course, and with a multi-perspective if you want. I use the German term because it refers to history, it refers to a culture that was very important in Europe, but not anymore now, because that kind of Central Europe does not exist anymore. I found this map, which is interesting. Usually, when I read newspapers or so, then still more than 30 years after the disappearance of the Iron Curtain, journalists usually still think in terms of there is Western Europe and there is Eastern Europe. Where I think, yeah, that was the case in the Cold War, but not anymore now. And then I liked, well, complicated maps such as this one, where it is said, well, let's reorganize Europe. Let's say that it's not only binary, it's not only Western and Eastern Europe. This is Northern, this is Western, Central, Eastern, Southeastern, and Southern. I come from Belgium, Western Europe usually, and then we think, yeah, we will not say that, but we still feel a bit better than those from the East. It's interesting because, well, let's leave out the United Kingdom because after Brexit, they don't belong to the European Union anymore. So what is left of Western Europe? The Netherlands, Belgium, and a part of France. That's Western Europe. That, of course, already gives a totally different perspective on how we feel and how our self-evaluation may be. Southern Europe, okay, Spain and Portugal, and a bit of the part of France and Italy. That's Southern Europe. But the rest, the Balkan and Greece, and so that's already Southeastern. So it's much more complicated, but much more interesting, I think, because you don't think in binary terms anymore. And Central Europe is huge, because here it is said, well, you can follow state borders, you can follow cultural proximities. I mean, how to assess cultural proximities, you can discuss that as well. But this is mainly, well, how the 19th century was organized with Germany and Prussia being very important. There in Estonia was a lot of German cultural influence. And of course, Austria-Hungary, the main Central European power in the 19th century. That is then actually Central Europe, much more important than all the others in a way. So yeah, just by creating a map, you create a totally different view on the world, and on, in this case, Europe. Yeah, Ukraine. You know, something is going on in Ukraine. This part of Ukraine belonged, according to this map, to Central Europe. Why? Because this part, well, this way, this part belonged to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire back then. So this was, well, mainly German-speaking as well. And you may know from the war reports, the main city in Western Ukraine nowadays is called Lviv. Also bombed, not, well, not taken yet like Eastern Ukraine, but bombed almost every day. This is a city where also Sherry Simon wrote about. And this is a nice book that I found recently. It was in Dutch, where already 3 names, there are more names actually, but already 3 names say something about the translation of a city. And when you travel there, do you travel to Lemberg, which is the German name? Or do you travel to Lviv, which is the Polish name? Or do you travel to Lviv, which is the Ukrainian name? That's the name nowadays. But of course, that already creates a totally different view on a city, and probably also expectation about how you will do that. We had Poland here. Poland is such an interesting case because hardly anyone in Western Europe knows about it. But this is what happened with Poland after the Second World War. They just moved Poland on the map. So after the Second World War, the Allies in the Soviet Union said, oh, let's move Poland with 200 kilometers. We bring it to the west. Can you imagine how you do that? So Poland, before the Second World War, was this, the white and gray part. That was Poland. And then after the Second World War, there were negotiations, and Stalin said, I would like to have a part of that. Okay, Stalin, you get that. That was Ukraine, but that belonged to the Soviet Union. And the Germans have lost the war, so this was Germany, but we'll take that for Poland. And now the new Poland is this. Can you imagine that someone tells you, Medellin is Colombian, but we're going to change that. It will be Ecuador, and everyone from Medellin, we will move them to a city that is now in Venezuela, because that's what happened. Many millions of people were just moved, for instance, from Lviv, the Polish city. They said, oh, this will no longer be Poland, but we got a new part there, so you can move there. That used to be Breslau in German, that is now Wrocław in Polish. And all the inhabitants from Lviv were moved there. Can you imagine? Everyone in Medellin, no, let's move to 300 kilometers to the east, or to the west, wherever. So that is what happened with many millions of people. So, of course, when we travel to such a city, when I was in Wrocław, I made a huge mistake probably, gave a talk there, and well, the first talk was in the evening before I met the colleagues, and I arrived there at noon, so I had some time, walked around. It was a nice city, still is a nice city, and in the evening I met the colleagues, and I made a mistake because I told them, oh, I like the city, but it looks so German to me. You know? Of course, yeah, it was a German city, but yeah, they didn't like it too much anymore. But so that said something about my mentality or about what I have read. I know German, I studied German, so I know the history of Germany. I know for me this is Breslau, but of course these people were chased away and replaced by those coming from there. But I think when you ask 100 people in Belgium, I don't think 2 persons will know about it. So that says something about our Western European perspective, if you want. Okay, I'll try to hurry up. So talking about Mitteleuropa, the German name, has a whole historical background, cultural background. It's not the same as talking about Central Europe. So it seems to be the same in English and in German, but it's not. I don't know how you would say it in Spanish, and what would be the associations you would make with that. This is about knowledge that we are translating, transporting, transferring all the time. This is interesting because we just went to the museum here of the university. What is indigenous? What was indigenous knowledge, and what has happened with it in Latin America? So the journal I mentioned you earlier, colleagues of mine have suggested that, we have accepted that. There will be a special issue, probably will be out beginning of 26, on this, translating knowledge in, by, and for indigenous communities. So the translation of knowledge is happening all the time and is of course related to these power situations and to the actors and the people dealing with it. So I think the call is out or will be out soon. If you feel like publishing on that topic, it's still possible because we will just launch the call on that. So the translation of knowledge, the translation of ideas. Of course, there are a lot of indigenous ideas that were, well, maybe integrated in new knowledge or not integrated, are still existing, but we do not know about them. Or maybe they were in different languages and how the languages relate to each other and so on and so forth. I wrote a chapter with a PhD student of mine on modernity in China and in the West, and how that was translated. A totally different concept of modernity, using the same term for a very different concept. It's about disciplinary knowledge. I mean, we work in a very international way nowadays. How do we exactly do that? Depending on with whom we collaborate. I usually do not collaborate with people in Latin America when it's in Spanish because I do not know Spanish. When they know English, I can collaborate with them. That will, of course, lead to a certain exchange of ideas. So you create networks of researchers based on power relationships, based on language knowledge, based on whether you travel there or not very often. You mentioned the translation studies bibliography. I'm one of the editors of it. We just made, well, that was just an exercise, kind of illustration, where we looked at co-authoring. Which authors collaborate, so which articles are co-authored by more than one author, and what does that tell us? Not a lot at this moment. This is only for the year 2019. It's not about publication activity, it's about co-authoring. And then, at least according to the database we used, we see that, oh yeah, in Europe a lot of people are co-authoring with Northern American, with Brazilian authors, with quite some Chinese authors as well. Within Europe we also see that, quite a lot in Spain, quite a lot in Belgium, in the UK. Okay, we still have to continue doing that, but that of course says something about the spread of knowledge and the spread of influences, how it's traveling as well. So, a lot of the things I mentioned about translation, I think there are quite some characteristics that all the time remind us of traveling as well. It is about border crossing. It is about a mimetic experience, not mimetic, but mimetic, referring to memes. It is about a metonymic experience, always a partial process. Which part do you translate, which part do you not translate? It is about different types of transfer, cultural ones, geographical ones, mental ones, epistemic ones, when it's about the translation of knowledge as well. And it's about how to present and represent something yourself, but also, for instance, in museum translation, what do you present there in an ethnographic museum, as we were talking about it earlier. So museum translation is something I like because there is also a PhD student working on that, and it brings together a lot of this traveling and a lot of this transfer of knowledge and a lot of translation. And museum translation is certainly not only about the interlingual part, which is also there. When we went to the museum of the university, or when we went to the museum of Antioquia, we saw that some things were translated in English, but most of it was not, it was only Spanish. Here we were looking at the floor of the indigenous people, but of course no indigenous language was there. Whereas a lot of people in Europe would think, oh, but Latin America, that's only Spanish and Portuguese. And you're traveling around in South America for a while. You went to villages in Bolivia where no one was speaking Spanish, for instance. So that complexity, that diversity is not always seen or known. So museum translation is about different layers of what you show and what you do not show. Yes, I mentioned ethnographic museums, former colonial museums that are completely reconceptualized and rethought nowadays. We organized a conference in Tartu exactly on that 2 years ago. We thought this is a niche topic. No, we got 70, 80 people who presented there immediately after the pandemic. So we were a bit surprised, but it was highly interesting. And I saw this at the Museum of Antioquia a couple of days ago, where they were actually dealing, well, I will not read you that text, also because it's in Spanish, but it's also this tension between how do you present and what do you represent. So that's constantly an interesting tension in museums, especially in ethnographic museums, but also when we translate and also when we travel, because that's constantly what we are doing, I think. I'm talking for almost an hour. I have an interesting example, but I'm not going to talk about it anymore because it will take too long. Or should I go on? I don't know. Really? Okay. Then it will be 1 hour and 15 minutes. Okay. Does anyone recognize this building? Maybe you can see it here. The J. Paul Getty Museum. So that's in LA. Do I have to say Los Angeles here or Los Angeles? So that already, you see, it's interesting. This is about traveling and translation, the way how I should pronounce the name of the city here. I was there almost 2 years ago for the ATISA conference. Well, I was in Santa Barbara, but I went there a couple of days earlier. And I thought, what can I visit? Well, the museum, the famous Getty Museum, was not open. It was on a Monday, I suppose. But they also have the Getty Villa, and the Getty Villa was open. So I went there. It says Paul Getty Museum, but it's actually the Getty Villa. Has anyone visited the Getty Villa? No. It's a very interesting translation case. Umberto Eco, the famous semiotician, wrote about this. About the Getty Villa there. Because, you know, Paul Getty was an oil magnate with a lot of money, was interested in arts, and went to Italy and visited Naples and the surroundings. And around Naples, well, you have Pompeii and you have what they call in Italian Ercolano, Herculaneum in English and in Latin, I think. So what is there after the eruption of the Vesuvius? Well, it's gone, but it was then rediscovered later, these villages. So it's an archaeological site. What do you still see there? Not too much, stones. But of course, archaeologists say, oh, this used to be a villa, a famous villa in Herculaneum. Getty said, interesting. I would like to reconstruct that villa. I'm gonna build that villa again, but not at the Mediterranean, but at the Pacific. So interesting translation, of course. No? So he wanted to build the full villa that is not there anymore, that probably once was there 2,000 years ago. But he has reconstructed it, has rebuilt it at the border of the Pacific. When I walked around there, I was constantly reminded of translation in that broader sense, because that's what we do. No? We reconstruct a text. And some of the quotes even, when he said, I want to recreate the Villa dei Papiri. Well, that's what we do as a translator. We recreate a certain text from the past, especially when it's a classical text. Or when he was saying here, well, some of the terms, of the metaphors, if you want, that he used as well. The embodiment of whoever created them, a mirror of their creator's hopes, and so on and so forth. A mirror, an embodiment that are metaphors we use for translation as well. So I was constantly reminded of translation while walking around in the Getty Villa. Okay, there is that arrow. There is a nice video, I think, that very much reminds us of translation as well. I'm not going to show the whole of it because it's 8 minutes. I will show you the first 2 or 3 minutes. And yeah, think of what has been going on in Paul Getty's mind and to what extent he was thinking as a translator when he wanted to reconstruct this or what he did there. Let's hope that works also sound-wise, and that well, also the people on YouTube will be able to hear what is said. Here? No? Sorry?
Nearly
The mouse.
2,000 years ago, near
Where's
the
the mouse?
Bay of
Here.
Naples, the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum flourished.
Reproducir.
It was a region with landowners and merchants, farmers and slaves, politicians and priests, doctors and courtesans. There were temples, shops, paved roads, and for thousands of people, it was home. In 79 AD, the devastating eruption of Mount Vesuvius buried Herculaneum and nearby Pompeii in volcanic ash and mud. In just a few hours, their communities vanished. But sealed beneath the debris was a record of ancient life waiting to be uncovered again. In the early 1700s, nearly 2,000 years ago, near the Bay of Naples, the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum flourished. It was a region with landowners and merchants, farmers and slaves, politicians and priests, doctors and courtesans. There were temples, shops, paved roads, and for thousands of people, it was home. In 79 AD, the devastating eruption of Mount Vesuvius buried Herculaneum and nearby Pompeii in volcanic ash and mud. In just a few hours, their communities vanished. But sealed beneath the debris was a record of ancient life waiting to be uncovered again. In the early 1700s, well diggers south of Naples discovered a trove of ancient marble artifacts. Over the next 3 centuries, archaeologists uncovered luxurious villas, courtyards, storerooms, theaters, and in them, rare objects of art and daily life from the people who lived and died there 2,000 years ago. These discoveries inspired billionaire oil magnate J. Paul Getty to reimagine one of Herculaneum's most spectacular homes, the Villa dei Papiri, here in California, overlooking the ocean in Malibu, a site remarkably similar to the original location on the Mediterranean coast. The cultures of Greece and Rome fascinated Getty, and in the 1970s, as his collection of ancient Mediterranean art grew, he decided to build a reconstruction of an ancient Roman villa in which to display it. He chose a design based largely on the partially excavated to help visitors people who created their children grow in a city by the sea.
But the rest was, of course, duplicating with variation. This is all about that. No? So what did Getty want to do as a translator, if you want, as a transformer? So the other side of the world, so also with a span of 2,000 years difference, but creating it in a better way. So this is about gaining in translation, if you want. So interesting what types of travel and of transformation were going on there. So nowadays, I think in the 21st century, we're talking about originality. Only for 2 centuries, because only since Romanticism, since about 1800s. Before Romanticism, duplicating was more valuable than creating something new. We can hardly imagine that, but that was reality in most parts of the world. And actually, nowadays, the end of the print era that we are, well, going through seems to lead to this kind of practice of post-originality, because the memes are the best possible example. We are constantly confronted with text rewritings. This is the age, the beginning of the age of text rewritings. Various offshoots, spin-offs, co-writings, adaptations, memes, recontextualizations. and translations, of course, they belong to that. No? These are all forms of what I called at lunch 2 days ago, text production. And an author, a novel, is not essentially different from what a translator is doing, because what the author is doing is also, of course, based on things that he or she has read before and is then trying to reconstruct. I mentioned it only once. I said, well, it's even made more obvious nowadays, because if it's done with artificial intelligence, when we use ChatGPT, then we do that as well. We use that as a kind of support, as a kind of help, but it's still up to us to decide how exactly we want to do that. AI and ChatGPT are doing that as well. They rewrite, well, depending on what we ask them to do. So we are all part of that continuum of continuous rewriting, if you want. And it's important to know that, and I don't think novels are original. They are a source text, but that the source text is in itself the product of different influences before as well. So this is about translation as a meme, translation as metonymy, about the movability of translation. And the movability of translation, as Loredana Porezzi has called it, is about traveling of translations, but also travel and translation. Okay, one last example. That is that article from Rodica Dimitriou, a Romanian translation scholar, which I liked a lot because it was about 2 travel books that were written about Romania in English, written in English in the 1990s. And she started, well, looking at that as a Romanian, of course. And then later, both of them were interlingually translated into Romanian. So it's interesting. The object of the English books is Romania, and then the English language books are translated into Romanian. Interesting. Imagine that happens with your country. When an English language author writes about Colombia with, well, certain Spanish terms or indigenous terms or whatever, and you would have to translate that into Spanish. That would lead to a lot of issues, I can imagine. The same happened there. The first one she called a cultural translation, because Romania and Romanian had to be translated into English, but that was a cultural transfer, an intercultural transfer of ideas, of perceptions, how these 2 English language authors looked at and approached Romania. And the second one was an interlingual translation, because a book in English was translated into Romanian, with a lot of issues appearing there as well. She noticed that there were a lot of preliminary stereotypes of the authors, the English language authors, that played a role, of course. They were constantly reminded of things. They were reminded of certain childhood reading. What was romantic, mysterious, what was magical, what a certain idealization they had about well, the few things they knew about Romania. Very much into a framework of a West-East scheme of interpretation. They were Westerners, and they were going to write about Easterners. That was even after the fall of the Iron Curtain, but nevertheless. So, of course, we are very much influenced by that. A lot of cliches there as well. One example, they arrived at Bucharest airport, and they said, oh, they both wrote something like, oh, this was unmistakably Romanian. I've been at quite some airports. There's usually not too much that is unmistakably national or regional there. But they saw that. So it was not like, I don't know, like JFK or like an airport in London. That's, of course, a type of self-confirmation. So it tells us something about the authors more than about the object, which is Romania in this case. And then there was a lot of cultural filtering, always against the own background. You filter out what is new. When I visit Colombia or Medellin or Antioquia or whatever, of course I'm constantly filtering. Oh, what is different from what I know? And that travel experience, well, requires a type of translation and of self-translation, where they said, oh, something reminds me of Ireland 40 years ago. Fine, yeah, because she grew up in Ireland in that case. So here again, like what we mentioned before, it's very often implicitly, I think, not too often explicitly, about experiencing a major and a minor culture. No? In that sense, well, you can call it colonial or post-colonial power hierarchy or an implicit hierarchy that was playing a role. Very much West versus, I wouldn't even say Eastern Europe, but the whole Orientalism idea that was present there as well. A lot of these adjectives, no? Something was peculiar or alien or strange, yeah, of course, to them. So that tells us something about their own world, but not so much about the Romanians. Can you imagine that these English language books are translated into Romanian? Then, yeah, the Romanian translator is probably not experiencing that as peculiar or alien or strange. So how to do that exactly? So the Romanian history was very much viewed through a Western grid, or at least that's what Dimitriu wrote, because she, as a researcher, of course, also grew up in a certain context, and she noticed that Western grid because it was not her grid. So you see, it works at different levels where you have to translate that. Okay, I come to my conclusion. So I talked a lot about translation, I talked about travel, but both in quite a broad sense, I think. So there are so many commonalities, I think, between translation and travel, and, well, in a second stage, also travel writing. Whenever we write about travel, or when we create texts, if you want, when we talk about translation, about traveling, it's of course the same. It's always, in both cases, about border crossing. It is about a selective perception and a selective representation. It is, in both cases, of course, about text production. And very much think about translation in society. We could also have travel in society, I think. It is about power relationships. It is about actors. It is about networks. No? Who decides on what, based on what exactly. So these, well, classical three types of translation, as mentioned by Jacobson the first time, interlingual, intralingual, and intersemiotic, they are all there. And cultural translation, as used by Dimitriu, is of course related to, well, very often all three of them. So I think when I go back to Europe and I have to talk about, well, South America or Antioquia or Colombia or Medellin or whatever, I will constantly think of this. No? Of course I have to do it that way. Well, you traveled through the whole of South America. Try to talk about this. You often say, oh, it was very different there than it was there. And then you mention countries, because countries are top of mind. But of course, within Peru or within Bolivia, there are a lot of differences as well. And so once we're in there, then we see these differences. We talk in Europe about the Americans, and we mean US Americans. But in the US, they say, oh, but the West Coast and the East Coast, that's very different. And the Americans talk about, oh, you in Europe. And then I think, in Europe, in Norway or Bulgaria, that's not exactly the same to me. Yeah? So it's all very relative, and it very often tells us something about the one who is producing the text more than about the object we're studying. I think that this is a very nice case of showing what translation studies is doing nowadays. And it opens a lot of perspectives for, well, interdisciplinary research, I think. It's still within the traditional boundaries of the source target paradigm. You know that, well, directionality in both ways, from the source to the target, but also the other way around. You know that nowadays in translation studies, some people go much further than that. And I have more hesitations there. I'll give you a couple of examples where some people will go in their conceptualization of translation beyond that source target paradigm. And I don't mean just the source text and the target text. No? Cobus Marais, for instance, together with a colleague of mine from semiotics in Tartu, Kalevi Kul, I quote them. Translation refers to the process of not semiotic, but semiosic exchange taking place in and between all organisms, even at the cellular level. A lot of people like this, but I think it goes very far, because then it means that almost everything is translation. I had to review a book recently from Ashley Riggs, who says literally, every form of communication is translation. First of all, the colleagues from communication studies will not like that. And secondly, I also think that we do need a a specificity for translation and the object of translation as well. That's why I think what I mentioned earlier, within the source target paradigm, that's still possible, I think. So there are many parallels to do research on, to investigate between travel and translation. And I think that can still be a very productive, very feasible, a very acceptable basis for interdisciplinary research, and those who are not from translation studies are very much invited to, I don't know, disagree with me. That's of course possible. Whenever you have a question, you can ask it now, or don't hesitate to write me on that email address. Thank you very much.
Luke, thank you very much for this terrific presentation. Not terrible, terrific presentation. Really interesting. So now I think the public has questions. And let's begin with Professor Juan Manuel.
Thank you very much. Professor Van Doorselaer, is that correct? Okay, sorry.
You can call me Luc.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. It was absolutely interesting, and I think it's very provocative. I mean, for us that have been like related to translation for a long time, and we tend to see translation from the traditional paradigm.
Who is we? When you say we tend to see.
We in Colombia,
Okay.
in Medellin, the University of Antioquia.
Okay.
Yeah. We as a yeah. When I say we, probably I'm saying I. Then well, okay, then I. No, but I think. Of course, I am familiar with this new paradigm and with this new vision of translation. And of course, it has to do with etymology, for example, because it has to do with the origin of the word itself, translatare, going from one side to another. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think that there is a central concept in translation that doesn't disappear with this new paradigm, and it is the concept of meaning and the concept of sense. Because I think at the core of both paradigms, there is the meaning that we give to whatever we are translating, and the meaning that we want to, first, how we interpret what we are translating, and how we transmit what we understand. There is what I mean by meaning. I don't know if you agree with me with that, with the role of meaning, or what do you think, what is the role of meaning in both paradigms? And once again, thank you very much for this so interesting presentation.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, I mentioned meaning, I think, when I talked about the two paradigms. So in the traditional view, there is the idea of the fixed meaning, the stability of meaning. And in the, what I call modern research view, well, that is problematized, that is questioned. There is no fixed meaning as such. As you said yourself, how we understand it, how I understand it, is not necessarily the same as how you will understand it. So, and especially not when there are bigger differences in culture, in language, whatever. So the whole idea of the change of paradigm is based on that, on the fact that there is no stability of meaning, whereas translation in the classical, traditional sense totally relies on the stability of meaning. So meaning is very important, but it's not about stability of meaning anymore. It's about the non-fixed meaning. That doesn't mean that everything is possible. That's not true either. But that's why we say we look at it from a descriptive point of view. We look at how things are being translated. And then you see so many differences. So meaning is, of course, still there. And remember that definition in Merriam-Webster it was, I think, change of substance, which is the meaning, substance, form, and appearance it was. So the substance is the meaning, but it's about change of meaning or possible change of meaning. And also that is, of course, a gradual thing. There can be a huge difference, there can be a small difference. But some of the examples, modernity in China. Talk about modernity in China and talk about modernity in the US nowadays. Something completely different. Not to mention democracy. Talk about democracy in the US or in Russia. They both exist, the terms, but they don't have the same meaning. So, you see, the non-fixed meaning is, I think, what this change of paradigm very much relies on. So in that sense, it's central.
But do you think that something of that meaning should be maintained or not necessarily? Because that's...
The should is the interesting verb here. Because I said it's from the normative or prescriptive view, which is should, to the descriptive view. Whether it should be maintained, well, for the commissioner, of course, the commissioner of a translation, and I mentioned that in translation practice, this traditional view is very much practiced, and it is said, don't change. But that's a different function in society, a translator, than a translation scholar. We look at how translation is being done. And well, I'm not in a position to say how translators should translate, which is, by the way, something interesting. I often mention that. When I say that I'm a professor in translation studies, very often the first question is usually which languages, and then I say, well, it's language independent, what I am doing. And secondly, they then also ask me, oh, professor in translation studies, and do you then translate yourself? Well, I actually have more than a full-time job. I would like to translate, but I don't have the time. But it's interesting. It says something about translation and the function of translation in society. Because my colleague in literary studies, they never ask him, oh, do you write novels yourself? Or my colleague in cultural studies, they don't ask him, oh, are you an actor yourself? Or my colleague in political science, they don't say, oh, so you're a politician yourself. So it says something about translation and how we receive and perceive translation in society. It is immediately much more associated with a practice. And I understand why, because translation is everywhere. Literary studies has a much longer tradition than translation studies, but of course, there are many more translations published every day than literature is published. So from a quantitative point of view, translation is much more important than literature, for instance. From a quantitative point of view, that's quite clear, I think. It's a business. Literature is, well, small business.
Thank you very much.
Since we're opening this cohort of the master's program, I have kind of a question on behalf of the students, I guess, which it is a methodological question. Like a traditional paradigm relies heavily on comparison, for instance, comparing the original to a translation to see what's changed. And we've seen like a good deal of work done on that sense. It has increasingly broadened to other kinds of analysis, such as contextual analysis. In what circumstances was the text produced? But I was wondering with this, it's not new really, but what kind of tools do translation scholars need to conduct this kind of study if a comparison is no longer the goal, or if it still is, what kind of comparison would take place? So I'm imagining that they're starting to think about what they're going to do. So if someone were interested in doing this kind of work, what kind of tools would they need? What kind of knowledge would they need? Because you're talking about, of course, interdisciplinary work, and that's, of course, something that we could all hope for. But I mean, they'll be working by themselves, mostly with their advisor in best case scenario. So, if bearing in mind that they're going to start thinking about their line of work, how would you kind of translate this into I guess, more methodological options and directions?
Okay, thank you. That's a very relevant question, I think, because yes, as supervisors of master thesis, that's usually, when a student comes to us, that's usually the first thing they say, oh, I have an idea, I want to compare two texts. If they want to do that, then my first question is usually, what do you want to compare in these texts? Then they say, oh, everything. You cannot compare everything. You need a certain perspective, a certain lens. This can be a lens, of course, so travel elements or travel-related elements can be selected from a text. That is when it's about comparison. So that is already possible to make a selection within text and translation comparison, I think. Secondly, well, I have mentioned translation in society, I've mentioned these sociological approaches. I think it's very productive nowadays to look at a whole scheme of, a whole network of who is deciding on what. Because when we look at translations, at texts, a source text and a target text, we very often start from the idea, oh, the target text, this is what the translator has chosen. Look at reality, this is of course not true. First of all, the title is a very interesting example. Why did the translator choose this title? Well, in most cases, the translator doesn't decide on the title. Most of the time it's someone working for the publishing house who decides on the title. So, but we often do not know. I was involved in several literary translations, and I have seen how many things that the translator had suggested, I was not the translator myself, but that the translator had suggested were not accepted or were corrected. So reconstructing this whole idea and network of who is involved in a translation, like here, that is also a very productive approach and methodology, I think. So very often I ask students to work with a mixed method approach in a way, where they also interview the actors or the agents, not the police agents, but the sociological agents, I would say. Once you know, when you talk to a translator, usually they then, if it's about interview as a method, they say, okay, I'm going to interview the translator. But based on the answers of the translator, you very often notice, oh, but there are a lot of other people who are involved there. The publisher is there, and there is a corrector, and there is an editor. So they all have to be involved, and that leads to sometimes a very complicated, but also an interesting network of actors involved in the production of a translation. So that is also called the sociological translation process, not the translation process in the sense that Holmes has used it, the psychological aspect, but the sociological process. How do you get to a translation? What stages are there, and who is co-determining that? Who is impacting on that? So I think that is, for instance, a method that, a combination of methods that can be very productive, and that is used a lot nowadays.
We have a question first from Tatiana, a student of the new cohort.
A student of the new master, or?
Yeah.
Ah, interesting. Don't tell me you're gonna quit the master after having heard me.
It's okay. So I just wanted to ask, because at some point you mentioned how at this point there's not really anything new that can be written, in a way. The sense that we can create a brand new sentence has really been blown away by the excessive exposition that we have to information right now. So what constitutes the difference between translation and just writing when we are thinking about all the information that goes into the author that's creating something new, but not really?
Yeah. I liked very much the formulation, what is the difference between translation and just writing? So usually it's the other way around, just translate. No,
Translating is better.
just write it. Yeah, thank you. Well, the idea that nothing new is written is not mine. I mean, postmodernism has worked on that a lot, of course. There are no real new ideas. Well, what I mean, is that there is no essential difference. I mean, writing also belongs to, well, this whole continuum of writing and rewriting, because that's why I never use the concept of original. Original gives the idea, oh, that's the holy original. That's where it comes from the Bible and from the Quran, and so that's where the holy original comes from. Of course, that was not new in itself. With the Bible, it's a very clear example. That was after an oral transfer of many people, and after that it was written down. Of course, every text is based on other knowledge and other texts that these authors have heard before. So in that sense, it is not essentially different. It is true that a translator is usually starting from one specific source text and then integrating a lot of other influences, whereas an author or a journalist, if you want, is usually starting from, well, more influences and not one clear source text. I've worked a lot on journalistic translation. Well, sometimes journalists are more or less translating what they have read in a different language, but very often it's based on a lot of things they have read, and they look at that newspaper, and they look at a news item on television, and they look at social media, and then they create a new text. So it's always the result of several other influences and texts. In that sense, I don't think there is an essential difference. There is a gradual difference where the translator is mostly based, where the translation is mostly based on one specific text, but mostly.
I guess I was thinking because you can interpret also the text as the context that we were talking about, cultural context, we were talking about also the country that you lived in, and how you view those differences in the source text in this way. So that's why I thought maybe this is either narrowing translation or really making it very broad.
Wow. Wow, I haven't had that question yet. You're going to write a very good master thesis. In what sense narrowing it down? Can you explain that again? How would I narrow it down?
Well, narrowing, I was thinking about when you said there's a specific source text.
Yeah.
And then if you have more than one source text, then is it not translation? Because
Well,
then you actually do have more source text.
Well, I said mainly based on one source
Mainly,
text.
yeah, I guess.
Not only, of course, because when I have to translate a specific source text, of course I have influences from my whole background and my cultural context and other texts that I have read about that. Maybe, depending on that source text, I will also want to read other texts about a certain topic. So, again, it's a gradual difference. I don't think a translator is ever working only with one source text. There are other influences as well, but mainly that one source text. And that, again, when you approach that from a descriptive point of view, again, I have worked on journalistic translation a lot. I think a lot of journalistic texts that we are reading are based mainly on one other text. I could prove that with a lot of examples, I think. But that is how, well, media networks and media text production is working. So in that sense, yes, there is more originality or combination, if you want, in a new novel, I suppose. But authors very often work consciously with intertextuality as well. They want to refer to other texts. They want to refer to other quotes, to other titles, and so on. So they play with it more. I think the freedom, the relative freedom, is larger, but it's not the essential difference between the two. And that's what I mentioned with, well, the age of text rewriting. Of course, we are constantly rewriting text, and in some cases there is more rewriting than there is writing. That's true.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about it because of all of the AI involvement right now, and how it's really intuitive for us to tell when something is written by AI, by how AI isn't able to do this playfulness, like really play with words and with influences. So I was just really curious about that. Sorry.
No, but it's very interesting. We were talking 2 days ago at lunch about AI and translation as well. I mentioned there that in a way translation and translators were a forerunner. No? Now other text-producing professions are noticing that, oh yeah, that's the case for us as well. With translation already for 10 to 15 years, we know that there is something like machine translation, and then the job has changed into post-editing more, and that is now what is happening with the other types of text production as well. I mentioned to some colleagues that this is already done for a longer time without us knowing it, with certain types of text, for instance, weather forecasts. They are already written for a long time by machines in newsrooms and so. So, but now it's extended to other types of texts, which in a way illustrates what I'm saying. It's all about rewriting and text reproduction, but to a different extent.
We have time just for two more questions.
A very short one. The traditional translation model has created a traditional translator profile. Yes?
Yes?
Perfect knowledge of languages, cultures, whatever. Yeah. You know that. So, what we're going to do with this new profile, with this new model? Because now I want you to tell me a new definition of translator. Not translation, the translator.
Yeah, good question. I can, of course, escape this question by saying I have a descriptive point of view, so I describe how practice is functioning. But I very well realize that translation practice, it will be, how was that on the moon? It's a small step for mankind. No, a small step for men, but a huge leap for mankind. Well, I think that is what translation practice will have to deal with in the next years or decades. Huh?
Steiner said that.
Well, it's already partly ongoing, the change from traditional translation to post-editing, but this will be intensified. And of course, very often translators have said in the past, oh, we don't like translation scholars because they are controlling and they are criticizing our translators, which is not true. We are not at all criticizing. That's not our task, I think. I think translation studies and translation scholars are very much, well, creating arguments for raising the status of translators. Because if you can make clear that translators are not just translating, but that they belong just as all the other text producers to, well, this type of profession, and that it's not only about losing in translation, but also gaining in translation, and that they are text producers like all the others, well, that should raise not only the status of translators, but also their payment.
Yeah. Thank you.
Luke, thank you very much for such an inspiring talk and presentation. I remember that this idea that you have been working on this new paradigm is not quite new. Actually, you have been working on that for quite a long time. I remember
applying it, yes.
I remember that around 2019, 2020, I got the opportunity by a professor in my PhD to have access to one of your papers that actually you published in Meta in 2016 about creating and narrating images from the Flemish TV.
Yeah, right.
And actually that gave me like the final kick that I needed in order to think about a module on comic translation if I was coming again here, which I did.
Yep.
And when I was just writing things in here and ideas about it, you were talking about post-originality, which is what is going on right now with comic translation and video game translation and localization in general. I want to do like a follow-up question to the one that actually was posed by Juan Guillermo, and it is from the other side and for the other level, not for the master's level, but actually for the undergraduate level and for the other part of the team, that is the professor, the faculty team. Do you have any advice for us from the point of view of translation didactics regarding this paradigm? How should we tackle this new paradigm in terms of translation didactics? Thank you very much.
Wow. Was this the last question? That's a tough one. Let me give a couple of examples from my own experience in translation didactics, if you want. Well, most of what I'm doing is giving courses on translation studies, but 20 years ago, I gave a couple of translation classes as well. And without knowing at that moment too much about the translation or the change in the paradigm, I think I already worked that way. What I did, for instance, is telling my students 20 years ago, that was translation from German into Dutch, telling my students, here is a text, and now make 3 different translations of it. So that was a way of getting them away from the idea, oh, I have to translate, so I have to stay as close as possible, as they usually say, to the source text. And yeah, the translation, the best possible translation is the one that has exactly the same meaning as the one in the source text. No, I worked already with different target audiences, where I said, this is for target audience A, this is for target audience B, which is, for instance, 16 to 17-year-olds, and this is a rewritten, summarized version for it, for instance. And in the beginning, they were very surprised, and then they liked it a lot. And I don't know how it is here, but I know a lot of colleagues in Europe who are complaining about the students, no, because the students, yeah, their language knowledge is so bad, and they are not able anymore to be very creative in what they do. Well, very often we may have that experience, but I had the opposite experience there. When I asked them to write for a youth audience, for a 16, 17-year-old, they were very creative back then. I don't have that course anymore. But that, I think, contributed to, well, that paradigm change. So don't look at translation as something, okay, there is the holy original, and now we have to stay as close as possible to that. And in the best of cases, we don't lose too much. No, they gained a lot in their, well, in the several versions, actually. And they enjoyed it as well. So I think this is a possible way of applying it in practice, what I was telling here. You can perfectly do something with travel writing text, of course. Ask the students to write about a recent travel experience for different audiences, that they also see that translation is a type of writing and not only rewriting. So that would be a suggestion, a practice that I have used and that worked quite well 20 years ago, but I think it would be absolutely the same now as well. So nice coming here.
Yeah, you can visit us whenever you want.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your presence here, and thank you and welcome to the new students of the master's program. I hope you like this.